So we know now how to use HTML to put content on the page, but how do we tell the browser how we want that content displayed? Like, what if we want to give it a different color or a different font? What if we want the title in the center or on the right, or a picture on the right and a paragraph on the left? In order to do this, we need to use something called CSS or cascading style sheets. Now, CSS works very closely with HTML tags. Each HTML tag can have either a class or an ID attribute that helps to identify each element and tells the browser how we want that type of element styled. The difference is that one class name can be applied to many different HTML elements, while a single ID should only be applied to a single element. So if we look at this code pen here, one example where you might want to use a class might be these list items, because there could be many of them and you might want all of them to have the same kind of styling. One example where you might want to use an ID, on the other hand, might be this picture of Benji, because there's only one on the page and you might want to give it very specific styling that doesn't apply to any other content on the page. Looking a little closer at our code here, we see we now have two tabs, an HTML tab and a CSS tab. Looking at the HTML tag, let's try to find a div with the attribute ID equals info. We can see that right here. We have that div with the ID equals info. And by giving this div that ID, we can now use CSS to specify styling for this specific element. So if we switch over to the CSS file, we can see how we actually write CSS to give styling to elements. There are three main ways that you can specify what kind of elements you want to style. As we mentioned before, there's the ID. And if you want to style an ID, you put a hashtag in front of the name of the ID. If you want to specify a class, you put a dot in front of the name of the class. And then if you want, you can also specify just a particular tag. So for example, we see here a body tag or a header tag, which would target the body here, everything inside the body, or everything inside the header. So similarly, you could have a rule that targets all H1 tags or all paragraph tags. Let's look a little closer at how each of these CSS stylings is written. So first you start off with your selector and then an open curly brace. And then you have a series of attribute value pairs. So you have the name of the attribute you want to specify, a colon, and then a value. There are a lot of different CSS attributes out there. We're only going to cover a few in this workshop, but feel free to search the internet to figure out how to style things in a particular way. And then at the end of each attribute value pair, you always have to have a semicolon. You can have as many of these as you want, and then you end it with a closing curly brace at the end. One thing that might be a little confusing right now is how we specify color. Like, what is going on with this 0097A7? So when you're trying to specify a color, the browser understands a lot of different formats for color. You could pass the actual name of a color, like green or blue. But the problem there is that obviously there's a huge spectrum of many, many colors, and those words alone can't identify each of those possible colors. That's why we have other formats such as hexadecimal, which is what you see here, as well as another one called RGB. And there are tools on the internet that you can use to translate from a particular color to what that would look like in hex or RGB format. So now that we've talked a little bit about CSS, let's talk specifically about how we could change the font of our content. So the browser itself by default only knows about a handful of fonts. And if you want it to be able to know about other ones, you have to import them from somewhere else. One popular place to do this is Google. You can search Google fonts and it will come up with a huge list of different choices, and you can see what they look like and choose what you want to import. So in order to do that, you're going to have to add this import line to the top of your CSS file, which tells the browser where to get this font from. Here are some other examples of other fonts that you might want to try out. And then you are able to add that value to the font family attribute. The way the font family attribute works, you see, it takes a series of values separated by a comma, and the browser will first try to do the first font, and if that doesn't work, it will try the second one, and so on and so on. So that's why there are multiple values for the font family. All right, so let's now try to do this ourselves. Let's try to change a few things using CSS. So let's open back our web editor. We're back in CodePen, and we want to add an ID attribute to the paragraph tag. So if you remember, the paragraph tag looks like this, looks like a P. So here is that paragraph tag. I'm looking for my family. So let's give it an ID, right? So we're going to say ID equals, and here in between the quotes, you can put whatever you want that makes sense to you. I'm going to say page subtitle. All right. That's number 2. Number 3, toggle to the CSS tab and make a new rule. Okay, so we've given it an ID. Now we want to actually target that particular element in the CSS. So if you remember, if you want to target an ID, you have to put a hashtag first and then the name of the ID. And this has to be spelled exactly the way you spelled it in the HTML, or else it's not going to work. You have your opening curly brace and your closed curly brace. I see I've already made a typo here, so I'm gonna fix that up first. Number 4, change the subtitle color by adding color yellow inside the curly braces. So we're going to try to change the color of this element by saying color, which is the name of the attribute, a colon, and then yellow, but you could choose whatever you want here. And look at that, our subtitle is now yellow. Great. Finally, let's try changing the font. So they ask us to add this font family line inside of the curly braces. So we're going to give a new line, add that. Remember, in order for the browser to know what this Roboto font is, we have to import it first. So I'm going to copy this, put it up top here with the other import statement, and watch our subtitle. It has changed font.